Alright, so we've moved on from Homo erectus and we are going to be talking about archaic humans. And today we're going to be talking about archaic humans starting with Neanderthal. So before we get into talking about Neanderthal, let's look at modern humans. Let's look at you and I and the anatomical features that we share. So modern humans have a large cranial capacity, around 1350 cc's. We have this high vertical forehead, so this high vertical forehead coming all the way up here, and small to little to no brow ridges. We also have a smaller face, and this smaller face is accompanied by smaller teeth, what we call a canine fossa, which is a little indent right in here, and the presence of a chin. We also have a prominent mastoid process and a very small occipital bun. Now really quickly before we move on, let's talk about this chin. We didn't really grow a chin. It's not something that we grew as Homo sapiens. But what happened is as our faces have gotten smaller, as our faces have shrunk, the chin has remained. And it's remained to give the mandible some robusticity, to give the mandible some integrity, and to protect it against getting broken. See, your mandible and your skull are probably the two hardest places on your mandible and your cranium are probably the two hardest places on your skull. They take the most amount of force to break. And the reason for this is, in our evolutionary past, if we were, say, to break our cheekbone or maybe our nose, we'd look a little ugly, but you'd survive, you'd be fine. However, if you were to break your jaw, or if you were to thump your head really badly or break your skull, chances are you would die. Therefore, the two hardest parts on our skull right now are our mandible, because its chin has remained, giving it some integrity, and our skull. Alright, so this is our modern anatomy. Let's go ahead and look at some archaic humans. Before we get into Neanderthal, really quick mention, because I don't believe it mentions it in your book, is Homo heidelbergensis. Heidelbergensis is an archaic Homo sapien, and it was found in Heidelberg, Germany, and it has these mosaic features of ancestral as well as derived. Again, we see some retention of ancestral or erectus features, so we see this large continuous brow ridge, has a larger face, large occipital torus, and there is no chin. So Heidelbergensis, again, I don't believe is mentioned by name in your book, so give a little heads up to Heidelbergensis. Alright, moving on. Let's talk about Neanderthals. We have quite a bit of evidence from Neanderthals, and this is in part to do with the fact that they are not that old. They date only back to around 28,000 years, so not the millions of years we've been talking about thus far. Also, they mostly dwelt in caves, and we find a lot of remains in caves. Therefore, these caves have helped with the preservation of these bones. And we do find that Neanderthals resemble modern humans quite a bit, especially in their postcrania or their after their skull, their anatomy. Now, their anatomy resembles modern humans so much that the taxonomy of Neanderthals is actually in dispute still. Some researchers choose to call it a completely different species, Homo neanderthalensis, which I believe your book does, and other researchers choose to classify it underneath our species as Homo sapien neanderthalensis. We'll come back to this debate in just a second. Let's go ahead and look at the geographical distribution of Neanderthals. They're found in Europe, Middle East, and parts of Asia. And the main thing to note about these areas is that they were very cold. So Neanderthal is found in cold regions, and we see its morphology, it's to reflect these cold regions as it adapted to live in it. Before we move on, let's look at really quickly cranial capacity and skull shape. So Neanderthals actually, believe it or not, have a larger cranial capacity than us. Females range between 1300 cc's and males around 1600 cc's. So there was also a good degree of sexual dimorphism. Now, this larger cranial capacity doesn't necessarily mean Neanderthals were smarter. It just means that they had larger bodies, and this bigger head reflects that larger body. Also, we see some interesting phenomenon happen with the shape of the skull. Here I have an example of a Homo erectus skull. If you remember, the widest part of the skull on Homo erectus is at the very bottom. Here I show a human skull right in here. The widest part of the skull on humans is at the very top. And here we have a Neanderthal. Well, it's right in the middle. Right in the middle. Looking further at skull morphology, we see that Neanderthals have this occipital bun. So remember, we don't. We have a reduced occipital bun. Neanderthals also have what we call mid-facial prognathism. So the middle of the face right here kind of juts out, whereas we don't. We have this smaller face. Now the forehead starts to rise a little bit more vertically compared to erectus, but still not as much as ours. And they do have this robust brow ridge and no canine fossa and no chin. Alright, so Neanderthals are adapted to live in colder regions, and we see this with a variety of different anatomical features as well as cultural features. The anatomical features that we see is a wide nasal aperture, and as it's explained in your book, this wide nasal aperture allows for cold air to come in and warm up before it is taken inside the body. We see that they are short, stocky, yet massive, so they have very little surface area, and this should remind you of Alan Bergman rule, so less surface area, less heat dissipation, the easier you're able to keep warm in colder climates. We also see that they're barrel-chested, reflecting a larger lungs and larger heart, meaning that they spent some time in higher altitude. And we have this larger infraorbital foramina. What the heck is that? It's that tiny little hole right underneath the orbits, and it's a hole that allows blood vessels to pass through. And your book does a good job of explaining why this is an adaptation for the cold, so I'm going to spare you my voice. Cultural adaptations for the cold include using hides. Although there's no evidence of sewing, there's evidence of hides being used to keep warm, as well as finding shelter in caves, as well as the use of fire. Alright, let's look really quickly at Neanderthal culture. Neanderthals are associated with the Mousterian industry, as well as the Acheulean tool industry, as well as the Upper Paleolithic industry. Now I'm going to pause you really quickly for a second. Description of these different tool industries are detailed in the next lecture. So if you don't understand what I'm talking about right now, don't worry about it. I'm going to talk to you about it in just a little bit. Alright, another cool thing we can do with Neanderthals, because of the amount of evidence that we have, is look at patterning in injury and disease on their skeleton. So we show a lot of healed fractures, and the patterning in Neanderthal fractures suggests that they were not only negotiating rough terrain, but after dangerous prey. And we can tell this in bioarchaeology by looking at repeated fractures to certain regions, and these certain regions indicate that Neanderthals were falling a lot. We also see that some injuries were so great that they would not have survived without aid. And this tunes us into the fact that Neanderthals were probably caring for other members in their group when those members could not care for themselves. This is signified especially by the Old Man of La Chapelle, which is also described in your book. We also find pathologies on several Neanderthal bones. And although we'll talk about pathologies in bones or disease in bones a little later in the semester, it's worth noting that we can start tracking the evolution of disease coinciding with the evolution of people as far back as Neanderthals. And let's talk about cannibalism a little bit. So we see scrape marks on bones, on Neanderthal bones, as evidence of butchery. So in the same manner that other animals are butchered, we see Neanderthals being butchered. And individuals are processed, meaning their marrow cavity is exposed using this hammer on anvil technique that you saw in the video last week in order to gain access to the marrow. And we do not know yet if this was for a ritual or for food. All of it still left to speculation. Alright, between this lecture and the book, you should be able to get quite a bit of information about Neanderthals. Before we move on, let's really quickly talk about this problem with taxonomy. So we've been going back and forth on whether or not Neanderthals should be a different species, whether or not Neanderthals, or whether or not we should lump species together, or slight morphological changes constitute being able to call them different species. And these two views are called lumpers and splitters. Lumpers are all archaic Homo, so Heidelbergensis, Neanderthal, and even some Erectus are thought to be just regional variations on one single interbreeding species. So researchers that are lumpers believe that all of these species that we've been talking about are actually just variations of one species of Homo. On the other side, we have splitters. Splitters believe that Erectus, Heidelbergensis, and Neanderthal were all distinct species, so they're opposite of lumpers. We have lumpers and splitters. All right, and that will do us for this lecture.